and welcome to the WPP Media Intelligence Podcast. I'm Kate Scott Dawkins. I'm joined today by Jeff Foster and Nidhi Shah. How's everyone doing today? It's recording Friday morning my time, not so much for either of you.
Yeah, doing well. It ended up being a very busy week, especially for a late July week, but lots of activity going on.
Yeah, coming back from the Amalfi Coast straight into the earnings couldn't be better.
Yeah, that is a bit of a rude awakening. Different pace for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, Nidhi mentioned earnings. We do have earnings to chat through today. We've got some of the world's key media owners, Google, ITV, Reach, Trace Media. We have Televisa Univision. We've got other media news to cover around Paramount, Warner Brothers, Discovery, Disney, NBC. And then we've got earnings from advertisers as well, running the gamut from Coke and Keurig Dr. Pepper through to Nestle, LVMH, Swatch, and General Motors. So we'll go round the houses on all these. And then there are also loads more companies next week. It feels like everyone's condensed it into a couple of weeks this time around with earnings. We've just got loads happening every day. All right, let's jump into it. Let's start with some media owners. We'll kick off with Google, which was this week. Total revenue grew 13% on a constant currency basis to $96.4 billion. Search growth, with search and other, accelerated to 11.7% as reported. Looks like we were right in our expectations so far from the This Year Next Year report that search wasn't going to all of a sudden crater this year. And actually, maybe we've been slightly too cautious for the year in terms of our search expectations. We'll have to see how the second half goes, but pretty positive there. I mean, that said, and other is a little bit ambiguous, right? So we are currently, as we speak, working as a team and within WPP Media on updating our estimates as to the various components and their shares within that, right? We have things like PMax and all of the AI-driven advertising that are contributing to Google growth. AI overviews, all these pieces. And so working out exactly how they all contribute and revenue and fees associated with all those could be a full-time job.
Yeah, it can be quite the task just to kind of parse all of that out, but it's pretty interesting to see it.
But really good growth, right? For all the articles about search changing and evolving and perplexity and OpenAI. I mean, volume of searches on Google, whether those throw up AI overviews or not, is still very, very high the world over. YouTube ads growth was 13.1% as reported, likely little under 13 on a constant currency basis, and quarterly revenue was $9.8 billion, which we talked about Netflix last week. That was $11.1 billion in terms of the largest streaming platforms there.
Yeah, and that makes sense, especially with all the viewership data we've been seeing. So that aligns well.
Although I will say, yeah, that's just advertising revenue for YouTube.
True.
And that was Netflix's total revenue.
True, exactly.
No, definitely still a ways apart in terms of what those two are. And actually, for Google, their YouTube TV and YouTube subscription revenue sits in another bucket, which is their subscriptions, platforms, and devices. That grew even faster, 20.3% growth for that segment. And it covers all manner of things from App Store commissions, content subscription revenue, and hardware from Pixel, Nest, and Fitbit. So again, you have to imagine that that's $8 billion just from ads for YouTube, and then you add on a significant amount of subscription revenue to that. Cloud as well, and that's followed very, very closely, especially for the investor set. The growth was 32%. Sounds pretty good, right? But then stock took a bit of an initial hit, mainly I think off the revelation of the higher CapEx spending. Google actually raised their estimate for CapEx this year to $85 billion from $75 billion. And the Q2 figure came in at $22.4 billion. So again, a lot of talk, a while back around maybe DeepSeek and other lighter models would mean less investment or less need for chips, but definitely not seeing that yet, right? We're still very much in the race to expand capacity. And in fact, Google said they were still had a backlog was growing and capacity constrained. Probably hear something similar from Amazon and AWS next week, I would assume.
I guess AI doesn't come cheap, right?
Definitely not. A couple of other interesting things. I think employee count for all the media attention that was getting, and in the tech world, Meta's year of efficiency and sort of this overhiring in the boom times of 21 and 22, and then right sizing in the last couple of years. Google added almost 1,400 employees in the quarter. They're now at 187,000, back above the level from 3Q22, and almost at the peak that came 2 quarters later at 190,711. So another sort of element of showing the investment that's happening in AI and making sure they have the skills and the people to really capitalize on that part of the business. The other thing for me that stood out, or one of the other things, was around search performance. And again, that double-digit growth, even in a quarter where we had the Liberation Day tariff announcements, the de minimis exemption changes. I was looking at a Tenuity wrap-up of Prime Day and talking about daily U.S. Google shopping ads impression share, showing Amazon, Temu, Shein, Walmart, and Target. And the impression share for Temu and Shein at some point in April and May just completely drops off, goes to zero, right? So to continue growing double digits, even with that sort of disruption in the middle of the quarter, speaks to, I think, comps make it a little bit more difficult, but I think it speaks to quite a resilient growth for Google still this year. Comments?
Do we think a lot of that is coming from some of the legacy media as well, and has likes of Google and other digital platforms kind of grow and continue growing? There's a lot of ad revenue that still is moving into these channels.
Yeah, is it coming out of? Yeah, I mean, I think that's potentially still a piece of it, and we'll have to see what kind of data we get from other new business growth around the world too, right? I think there's definitely an element of some companies, especially in the tech space, looking to grow now around AI terms and AI products and services, where there's going to be appetite to spend regardless of the economic scenario, just because it's at the time that people are forming these associations and loyalties. But I think they said actually financial services and retail were the sectors driving growth. We had several of the European media players too this week.
Yes, we did. In the UK, we had ITV and Reach report, and in Spain, we had Atresmedia. Media. All three reporting a decline in advertising revenue. Reach reporting print advertising declining by 15.4%. ITV had a decline of 7% in the first half of this year, and that was mainly due to sports, the tough comparables to the men's Euros last year. But also, I thought what was interesting was the decline they reported in certain sectors, such as gambling, FMCG, autos, and alcohol ad spend. And finally, Atresmedia, they report audio-visual advertising revenue, which is mainly TV, but also includes things like their proprietary websites, influencer marketing, and other media. That declined by 5.1% in the first half of this year. And while they don't disclose advertising revenue for radio, they do report net revenue for radio, which is a small segment, but a growing one, which had a growth of about 4.7%. I think not just one, but some of the key takeaways from the earnings this week has been, the clear shift towards kind of digital formats for some of these legacy media companies. We are seeing digital advertising revenue for ITV growing quite strong at 12%, but it's not offsetting the decline, say, in linear TV. And Reach mentioned about their digital revenue and the kind of direct revenue they get from agencies and advertisers declining, but the indirect revenue from social platforms and programmatic growing during the first half of this year. So I thought that was quite interesting, something which I haven't looked into before. So it was fascinating.
Well, I saw in the notes too, at least for ITV, increasing sectors, airlines, travel, entertainment, and leisure. people are traveling, maybe less so to the United States from the UK, but other places. So maybe convincing those travelers who were planning a vacation to maybe consider other destinations or maintain that travel spend, even if the destinations are changing.
That's true. And I think I might have had a role to play in that as part of all my travel journeys this year. So hopefully more travel this year as well. But yeah, I think it's interesting, right? You mentioned, Kate, about Google and the growth there, right? And I think one of the interesting things that came out in the Reach earning calls was how AI-driven changes in the search is impacting revenue. And they mentioned not having a material impact as of yet, but that is still on the radar and something they're looking at. So maybe not so material now, but something definitely we all are keeping an eye out, right, for in the future. And I think really the key theme of this year within kind of the European media landscape is, strategies and diversification. These are kind of the buzzwords: consolidation, looking at new ways to reach audiences. ITV mentioned about, their YouTube partnerships and how that is growing incremental reach, particularly amongst younger audiences. And the Disney content partnership, way to grow inventory, which I think is very fascinating, alongside opening up to SMEs using generative AI to create those cost-effective ads and making TV accessible for some of these smaller advertisers. So lots to look out for, I think, in the next year, and lots of developments happening within the space.
Yeah, lots of optimism. I mean, the trick is going to be executing it and doing it in a way that is cost effective, right? While you're also losing a long-standing and profitable part of your business in terms of linear TV. So I think VIX from Televisa Univision has done well in that space, Jeff, in terms of leaning into the streaming side of things and being a source of revenue growth for Televisa.
Yeah, and they reported earnings, and it was, pretty similar to what we're seeing across a lot of other media owners, where some softness on the advertising side, but some strength on the streaming side. So when looking at their top line, their total company revenue fell 4% to just about 1.2 billion, and that was mainly due to an 11% drop in ad revenue in Mexico and a 23% decrease in subscription and licensing revenue in Mexico. So when looking at that, total ad revenue was down 5%. And U.S. revenue was up 2%, but that was with a 2% drop in advertising revenue. So parsing all of that, basically ad revenue down, streaming and other revenue stronger.
Yeah, Mexico was mentioned by a few of the CPG companies too, in terms of weather playing an impact there over the last quarter, second quarter, both in Mexico and India, with rains, I think, in India, and adverse weather in Mexico also causing some pullback in spending. It's fascinating, all the things that impact advertising and revenue growth, weather being a key one in some markets. So maybe we see some of those numbers pick back up next quarter. Interesting.
Yeah.
Are they talking ahead to any of the sports coming up, or tactics they're looking at?
Not a lot, just expressed excitement over their revamped content strategy and some of their new leadership hires. So that was pretty much the focus of that. They had warned that there would be softness in the US ad market. So I don't think any of this was a big surprise. I would say this is pretty much in line with what expectations were going to be.
Well, and the party line from legacy media owners, right? Softness in the ad industry.
Right.
But what they aren't saying is softness in the linear TV or
TV.
Right. It's not that the industry is contracting by any means, right? We're still expecting 5.6% in the US this year.
Yeah, I would say it's right. If you were to translate executive speech, it would be softness in certain aspects of the media industry.
There you go. And there's plenty of other media news this week as well, across the board, really internationally as well. We should start with, where do you want to start? We got lots. We got Paramount in Africa, Warner Bros. Discovery in New Zealand.
Yeah, I think the Paramount in Africa is an interesting one. Of course, this news came out before the Paramount deal. Looks like it's just about to be closed. They went through the final hurdle of getting FCC approval here in the U.S. So that deal should be officially closed probably within the next few weeks or so. But before that, it did come out that Paramount Global may close down their Africa offices amid a strategic review. So the company is shifting its focus to streaming in high growth regions and reviewing all of their different territories and strategies. So interesting to see that. I guess, guess it's sort of indicative of where pay TV is standing, especially in some of the other international markets.
Yeah, like Disney was sloughing off some of their international linear channels several years ago, right? So I don't think this is necessarily super surprising in the longer term evolution of TV. You also had Warner Brothers Discovery selling their New Zealand channels to Sky New Zealand for a nominal 60-cent price. So Sky will become New Zealand's dominant TV media player by acquiring 100% of the shares in Discovery New Zealand from Discovery Networks Asia Pacific. This is via Deadline, and Deadline article, by the way. So we'll have around 35% of the linear TV ad market, according to that piece, ad market revenue share, and 24% of the digital TV equivalent. So looking to, again, I think, focus on streamlining, cutting assets or spinning them off where it makes sense, and then focusing on, the highest revenue drivers, biggest growth, and really streaming for the most part for these players as they look at competing with Netflix and YouTube and others.
Yeah, exactly. I think we're maybe entering into a phase, pretty much in most markets where costs is going to be under a microscope, and maybe in the past they may have let it slide since the subscriber revenue was high enough, especially on the linear side. But I think now we're in a new territory where profitability on a show-by-show basis or by particular content is really going to be coming under focus.
Yeah. There's a bit of other news, too, around sports.
Yeah, so this is another interesting one that we've been keeping an eye on for a while. So with the NFL and Disney, mainly their ESPN side, are in advanced negotiations to finalize a deal where ESPN would acquire a major stake in NFL media. There are some reports saying it would be a 10% stake, but that's all speculative. But the way it would work would be that ESPN would acquire the NFL Network, the Red Zone channel, and of course get the 7 regular season NFL games that are currently broadcast on the NFL Network. The deal is expected to be valued at approximately $2 billion, and the NFL owners are going to be voting on it probably next month, so into August. So it's an interesting one because, obviously for the NFL, it would provide a nice cash infusion and, would get visibility throughout ESPN's platforms. And for ESPN, it would significantly bolster its NFL content, which they I'm sure would love to have ahead of their streaming service launch. And of course, the other longer term play is with the NFL rights up for renewal in a few years. This just further entangles ESPN and Disney and the NFL. So it'd be very strange to see the NFL walk away from a deal with them if they have an equity stake in ESPN. So you can kind of see a lot of the reasons behind this. So it will be an interesting one to see how this plays out, but it looks like it's going to happen in some form.
Yeah, we talked last week, a couple pods ago, around there's so much desire for sports that networks are moving into, even those sort of second and third tier sports, at least in the US. That would be things like lacrosse and rugby, although rugby is a major league in other markets. Those almost feel even more ripe for these sort of partnerships and extra deals where it may not be straight rights money. And especially we talked about the, rights deals in Europe haven't seen the same kind of across the board price increases that we've seen in the US. But maybe some of these more partnership models would be interesting in other regions where you're not going to have the same kind of ad load as you would in the US, but they're still looking to create relationships that maybe leave those on free to air channels or versus going to streaming. So interesting.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating model. Of course, it raises some conflict of interest questions, but what doesn't these days?
What doesn't? All right, and then NBC Sports. I mean, this one, who knows? Maybe
it's kind of what's old is new again. I guess that NBC is, I guess, thinking about reviving their NBC Sports Network, which is funny because they killed it off. What was it?
2021, I think.
Yeah, about 4 or
Yeah.
5 years ago. Exactly, because it wasn't profitable. But obviously, it just shows you how much things have shifted in the last 4 or 5 years, with just sports being kind of like this monolith and almost like a completely separate market within media.
Yeah.
Enough so that NBC is willing to revive the network. It's interesting. The thinking behind that is that they would probably simulcast a lot of the sports content that would be on Peacock. So, namely, like the NBA would be probably one of the primary sports that would be simulcast. So, it's interesting to see, because a big focus of that deal was getting people to subscribe to Peacock. But if you can get an NBCU sports channel and get the games without having Peacock, it's an interesting question.
Yeah, look, we were always going to be in this halted step across from legacy TV to streaming, right? It's not like you can decide as a company to flip a switch. There are still millions of people in households with pay TV watching linear TV for many hours a day, and they're all trying to navigate how best to take advantage of that and take advantage of the subscriber fees that come along with cable, at the same time as promoting and growing these streaming assets that they see as their future. Reminiscent of how CEO of GM, Mary Barra, was talking about the shift to EVs. They recognize that that's the future. They're signaling that to long-term investors. We know we're headed this way. And we have this dual model right now where we still have a lot invested in, ICE vehicles, internal combustion engines, and there's still a market for those. And so, I actually feel for them in terms of trying to do both things. We're in that space as well. We have a lot of legacy Excel models that we are still working off of, and at the same time building a lot and designing a lot for databases and agent-based intelligence, because that's the future. But not everything is ready yet, or not everything is easy to translate, and people who have been using data sets for a long time want it a certain way. And so in these periods of technological change, whatever that might be, the transition period is always going to be a bit messy.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's like we're in the middle of this inflection point, except this inflection point across many industries and sectors is a pretty large swath of time. And I think, you're seeing that a lot in the auto earnings, where it's pretty clear, based off of where the industry is going, that most people agree that electric is the future. It will happen. It's just a question of when and when the market's ready for it. And of course, there's a lot of other underlying factors, especially in the US, about infrastructure, those sort of things, and affordability. But it's it's very interesting to see that, reflected in the earnings, that, it's sort of like we're definitely in this transition phase where internal combustion engines and still selling well and still have a lot of demand.
Yeah.
But it's just a question of how much longer is this, going to.
Well, let's talk autos then briefly. There were several reported. I wrote down a few notes on General Motors. Reported revenue of $47.1 billion, down 1.8%. Total vehicle sales of 974,000, nearly 3/4 of which are U.S. sales. By the estimates in their earnings release, that gives them a 17.4% share of U.S. vehicle sales. And there were some questions to management around how GM expects to be profitable with EVs. The question specifically said when players like Tesla apparently cannot, from Adam Jones at Morgan Stanley. And Mary Barra actually mentioned the importance of brand, I think, there. She was, I'll read from the transcript quote here. I think when I look specifically at General Motors, one of the reasons our EVs are doing so well from a customer perspective is that they're true to our brands, whether it's Chevrolet, whether it's Cadillac, whether it's GMC Hummer and GMC. Also beautifully designed vehicles that have the range and the performance that customers are looking for. I think the importance of brand and new to brand, I've seen articles talking about how well actually Cadillac EV sales are doing in that luxury space, and how many of those buyers are new to brand. And so I think that's a space where, in terms of marketing and advertising, which historically Tesla has eschewed to a large part, may potentially help some of these more legacy auto brands position themselves well for consumers. I think there's always a strength in presenting the brand and a message and a qualities of a brand to the market, right? In that space, especially as you're trying to convince people to either switch from ICE to EV or pick your EV over others. And she also had some comments around being successful in China, where GM has a deal with SAIC, and talking about Cadillac as the luxury there as well. But, still down on the quarter. And they talked about tariff impacts over $1 billion, as did VW, over $1 billion in terms of tariffs. So this category, I think it's going to be important for them to continue having those brand messages in spite of really taking those hits to profitability from tariffs that have been levied this year.
Yeah, because I think now that we're entering the second half is what we predicted. I think we're going to start seeing some of these impacts. And of course, auto industry probably will have, bear a substantial brunt of the impacts of tariffs. And we're beginning to see that. But you're right. I think, getting the branding out there, that what Mary Barra talked about, I think it makes a lot of sense when you look at, especially at GM from a brand perspective, some across the board on the EV side, from Cadillac all the way down to the Chevrolet brand. And I think, they're doing a good job messaging about their different models at different price points.
Same true for Ford too, right? With the EV trucks and the Mustang, and great lineup of EVs from Ford internationally as well. And so watching their earnings as well. We're not going to get to everything today, but we will circle back and certainly have more of a deep dive on auto too. What else? We had luxury with LVMH, still challenged at luxury this year. I mean, they enjoyed a couple of really high growth years there, but definitely a little bit more challenged this year. Yes, Nidhi?
Yeah, signs of weak demand kind of continues, particularly in China. I think what was kind of interesting was looking at Japan, which has also been a very high growth market. And this first half, Japan for LVMH has seen a decline of 15%. A lot of that growth coming in previous years from tourist spending, and with the weakness of the yen. A lot of impacts, not just in China, but also in Japan being noticed now. And they also reported advertising and promotion expenses being down at 4%. But it was just interesting to see that the kind of share that the advertising and promotional expenses as a percentage of revenue stayed pretty similar to what it was for the full year, so around 11.3%, and full year being 11.5%. So not much of a difference.
Yeah, they made a big point too. I remember on the call about calling that out, right? That on a percent of revenue basis, it was the same. So maybe a decline in terms of absolute value, but not in terms of percentage. And then also calling out the fact that category, because for LVMH, it's advertising and promotional. And so there's a lot that sits within that, and that it wasn't necessarily the communications piece of that was going to lose absolute funds. It could have been, point of sale and kiosks and those pieces that were seeing declines more so than the media piece, which is a theme we talked about in this year, next year. Companies looking for flexibility and savings within sort of non-working media or within those big buckets of promotional and marketing spend, and applying that actually into working media, that was sort of the beneficiary of some of these cost savings in other areas. Cool. And we also had a couple of others. Again, there were way too many this week for us to go through all of them, but we're just trying to pull out, I think, the most salient pieces, especially for marketers and our listeners. The one other one I'll mention here, I think, is Nestle. Organic growth of 3% for Q2, driven by pricing. It was one of the things, as I've been reading across a number of the CPG and beverage companies over the last couple of weeks, I will do Coke as well, was just this sort of, we're back to pricing being a key driver of organic revenue growth for these companies. That was what they were reliant on during the high inflation period following the COVID recovery. And then we had sort of after that a lot of talk about getting back to volume growth. Now we have tariffs. We have sky high cocoa prices and coffee prices driving up input costs. And so we're sort of back to this world of revenue gains being driven primarily by price. In a lot of cases, there are some examples where it's evenly volume driven, but I think a lot of these companies are still really trying to figure out that volume lever as we go into the back half of this year.
What else? I think that's been similar to what I've been hearing in financial services, where companies are reporting not seeing a complete slowdown from the consumer standpoint, despite interest rates being high. So really the kind of odds of recession dropping, as I heard from the Morgan Stanley earnings call. So not all gloom and doom.
Yeah, and Coke talked about different types of consumers too. Coke was organic growth of 5%. Total revenue up to 12.5 billion. They talked about, overall, the U.S. business did a very strong job in coming back from a slower start in Q1 and getting sequentially better in Q2. What else? Quote, I think that's in the context of a pretty resilient overall consumer. The aggregate spend is holding up. Yes, there's some pressure in those lower incomes where we're targeting some affordability and some special focus on marketing and occasions. So I think the overall outlook continues to be resilient, and we're investing for growth in that out from the Coke earnings call. So they were obviously talking about their big relaunch of the Share a Coke campaign. Pretty astounding numbers, really, in terms of being in 120 countries, 10 billion bottles, 30,000 names tailored to local markets. Of course, our OpenX team helping with that. And they did talk about in the call, actually, how much this organization of having a global marketing focus was allowing them to take learnings from one market and apply them to others, and being able to quickly pivot to consumer pressures. They talked about, Mexico and Turkey and applying learnings from Turkey to Mexico. So it was really interesting to hear them sort of speak on the call to how they're taking learnings market to market and applying them and taking a more global approach to marketing and comms and revenue growth management. All right. Well, what are we looking forward to next week then?
I think we can say more earnings and more economic news.
Yeah, no, it's a long list for next week. I mean, PayPal, Spotify, Procter & Gamble, Etsy, Kraft Heinz, Hershey, Comcast, Colgate, Palmolive, Apple, Amazon, Meta, EA, Microsoft. Loads. Unilever, Danone. So lots in there to get excited about.
I think we'll have a pretty good idea of some economic signals in the next few weeks, and as we head into the back end of the year and as we start thinking about our forecast, I think this will definitely give us some good inputs.
Yeah, we did have enough of the non-alcoholic beverage players where I updated our composite view. And actually really consist on a composite level for non-alcoholic beverages, coffees, waters, soft drinks, 4.4% organic growth in Q1 and 4.4% organic growth in Q2. Steady sort of mid-single digit, and CPG is the largest contributor to global advertising revenue. So I think that points to our expectations of a slightly more muted but still growing sector over the full year.
Yeah, I think that's looking like what is shaping up to be. There's also another interesting article in the Wall Street Journal just saying so far, the consumers have not really been impacted by tariffs as much as the companies have been taking the hit. So
I saw that. Yeah.
I think, that's where we are now. Of course, that could change, but it's been interesting to see that there's been enough data out now to, sort of confirm what we thought, that, maybe this may not really impact the consumer as much as as some people were anticipating. I mean, obviously there'll be a degree of an impact. It's just a question of what.
Or that the super high growth, again, double-digit growth from digital players. We'll get more on that next week, but that's going to carry us through to, even if it is a slower back half, that we've front-loaded quite a bit of strong growth this year that's going to carry us through to a pretty decent full year number.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, we will catch up on all of that next week. Jeff, I hope you survived the heat of New York today. And Nidhi, I hope you can hold on to that holiday feel a little bit longer through the weekend.
Yes.
All right. Thanks for listening. As a reminder, the WPP Media Intelligence podcast is meant for informational and entertainment purposes only and should not be considered financial advice. If you have comments or questions for the show, you can email business.intelligence@wppmedia.com.